the overview of the lecture series. So today we're going to talk about civic virtue. The next week we'll talk about civic principles and rights, just as a reminder, and I'll mention it at the end of the evening. But civic principles and rights will probably be a longer evening, so be prepared for it because there's a lot to go over. I think you will be appreciative of it, but it will be a longer evening. Then we'll do the institutions of government, and we'll finish up with withstanding crises. So we've had a few crises in our history. And so we'll find, okay, the resolve that our country has had to withstand those crises. I began a nonprofit in 2015 called the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education as a follow-up from as a purposeful opportunity for me to continue the work that I did with my students. When I was a teacher, I taught a We the People program. It was from the Center for Civic Education. It was a program that I did with my students for 19 years before I retired. It's also another program that we do, which is called Project Citizen, and that program is for civic engagement. And then in 2015, we also started another program called Citizen Lyceum, which I'm going to talk to you about in a few moments. And our mission statement, as you can see, it's threefold: to develop generations of responsible, educated, and involved members of society by promoting civic learning, active engagement, and significant contributions to democracy. It's a pretty expansive type of mission statement, but it's our hope. The Citizen Lyceum is a program that I started 10 years ago for the purpose of fostering adult learning, but it came from Aristotle's Lyceum that he began in Greece for the very purpose of promoting philosophic and scientific discussions among adults. In 1826, the American Lyceum movement began right here in Millbury. So, interestingly enough, you might expect that we will try to honor that next year in its 200th anniversary, since the American Lyceum movement did not only originate here, but expanded from here. Before the Civil War, there were nearly 350 lyceums throughout the country that existed pretty much throughout the Northwest, or excuse me, the Northeast, through the Midwest. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln gave one of his most important talks at a lyceum in 1838. So you'll hear more from that through next year as we celebrate our 200th anniversary of the Lyceum, which originated right here in Millbury. So as you can see, our Mackey's Citizen Lyceum is intentionally, purposefully aimed at promoting and discussing those aspects of American government and discussing its principles, its values, its institutions, so that people can get a better idea about our government and know more about the government. These three words pretty much resonate, I think, with most of you. I think you've heard them and seen those words before. As you recognize these words, you'll note that these words are the opening of our Constitution. They're often called the preamble of the Constitution. Tonight, we're not going to look at them from their political purpose. We're going to look at them because or from the reasoning that is our focus, and that is from the purpose of civic virtue. Our focus is going to be why was this Constitution so important from the viewpoint of the people? It was important that the people, if this government that was being created by the founders was to be successful, the people needed to be virtuous. The 6 purposes of our government are to form a more perfect union. The previous Constitution was called the Confederation. It didn't do the job, at least many people did not think it did, and so therefore they needed to form a more perfect union. But they also needed to want to form one that was more perfect, because the people needed to be more perfect. To establish justice, and justice, should be for all. To ensure domestic tranquility. There were issues, obviously, among the Indians, and so there needed to be some peace. Provide for the common defense. We had issues, obviously, with the British, but there was also concern that even our allies in the Revolution might, want to take some land, the French, the Spanish. Promote the general welfare, a nebulous term, a term that one might say, what does that actually mean? However, from the point of view of everyone's welfare. And secure the blessings of liberty, but if we continue the words of the Constitution, to ourselves and to our posterity. So this Constitution was not designed for the moment, but it was designed for the future. So how can these purposes be achieved? In the minds of our founders, they can be achieved by a virtuous people. So, what was virtue like in the time of our founders? As you can see, in the 18th century, virtue was reinforced across all of the institutions in the communities throughout that time. It was reinforced through the family, through schools, through the churches, as well as through the government. So essentially speaking, everyone essentially was, if you were a child especially, influenced, to be virtuous. These were inculcated by the parents, by the extended families, by the school teachers, by the different churches, whether they were Christian or Presbyterian, the Puritan churches, the Congregational churches, the Baptist churches. All of the churches, were all promoting virtue. The local governments as well as the state governments. Now, why was this true? Well, a good part of that came as a result of the Renaissance. the Renaissance in the late 14th and into the 15th century, and later promoted through the 16th and 17th century Enlightenment, they would be reading about and learning from the Greek and the Roman philosophers, like Cicero, Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras, just to name a few. Not to mention as well the Eastern philosophers, Buddha, Confucius, many of the Indian, philosophies as well. They were now learning and finding about and looking at these various philosophies that were promoting this kind of moral philosophy. So this was not something that was minor, it was something that was promoted very, very much, at that particular time. Now we're going to look at 4 of our founders. They are merely 4 of many of our founders who essentially were steeped, if you will, in studying the moral philosophers. So Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. Let's take a look at Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, like many of the young men of his time, was influenced by Pythagoras' golden verses and Cicero's Tusculan disputations. At the age of 22, he wrote up a list of virtues which he decided he would review each night to see how well he did, with the hope that he would improve himself. If he failed, he would put a mark next to that virtue. Yet, he would continue his self-reflection. He had a Quaker friend who noted his 12 different virtues and suggested to him that he needed to add a 13th. He said that his pride was a little bit suspect and that he probably should add humility. Benjamin Franklin decided to add his 13th. This experiment didn't last too long. It became a little bit too difficult to assess each night, each of his 13 different virtues. However, despite the fact that it was not this evening ritual, it did not stop his daily self-improvement or his lifelong journey to improve himself. These virtues continued to be a goal for his self-improvement. Then we have George Washington. Now, George Washington, at the age of 16, he wrote out all of the 110 rules found in the rules of civility and decent behavior, and would reread those often in his later teenage years. These rules were very familiar to young men. They may have originated in the late 16th century, but this version that he would have written probably came from Francis Hawkins in 1640, that version. These were rules of behavior to improve oneself, to gain self-respect, and to mostly learn how to respect others. Details on etiquette how to dress, how to walk, how to eat, how to address one's superiors. It is often stated that this may have contributed to Washington's humility and his courtesy, how he was very courteous and respectful of others, as well as how he was able to control his anger. Thomas Jefferson. Like Franklin, he was also influenced by Pythagoras and Cicero. And as you can see from his shortened list of 12 statements, I've only chosen 7, that Thomas Jefferson wrote in his late teens, many of the virtues that he discussed were similar to Franklin's. And some of these I think you will have probably heard during your course of your life. Never put off to tomorrow what you can do today. Now, you may not use that phrase, but your parents may have used it to you or have heard it from others. Never trouble another with what you can do for yourself. Never spend your money before you have it. I don't think credit card companies would like to hear that. Take care of your cents. Dollars will take care of themselves. We never repent of having eaten too little. Think as you please, and so let others, and you will have no disputes. And when angry, count to 10 before you speak, and very angry, 100. Then we have John Adams. In his diary, he wrote about his failings and his eagerness to improve himself. And like other young men, he too sought inspiration from the ancient philosophers. One of the striking features of Adams is his relationship between he and his wife. Because John spent so much of the time away from her and his family during his service to our country, their letter exchanges are pretty remarkable. Beyond the substance and content of everyday life, it is the amount of time they spend discussing virtue and its importance in their lives and in life in general. The quote below is fascinating not only because of the author, but because of the topic. Let me give you a little bit of background on Epictetus. He's a Roman slave born in 55 BC. His master treated him pretty poorly. So poorly that he broke his leg. Epictetus accepted that. He accepted it because he had no control over it. So when you read the quote that I have, you'll understand why. Because as he says, some things are under our control, while others are not under our control. Under our control are conception, choice, desire, aversion, and in a word, everything that is our doing. Not under our control are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, everything that is not of our own doing. So when his disciples said to him, "Why aren't you angry about the master having broken your leg?" He said, "Why would I take time away from my life being angry about something that I had no control over?" So the essential virtues emphasized by the founders are that list. And I put that list under there. If somebody wants to turn it over now, they can. Thank you. those aren't the only virtues that we have. But those are the 13 that Benjamin Franklin had, plus, okay, 3 additional. But these aren't the only virtues, but they were essential ones. Temperance is also called self-control, order, putting things in their right places. Silence, meaning don't speak unless you have something good to say. Or take the time to phrase what you need to say. Resolution, if you make something and say something that you're going to do it. Frugality, be thrifty. Industry, keep busy. Sincerity, justice, fairness, moderation. Do things, okay, without excess. Cleanliness, tranquility, peace, chastity. Humility, not prideful. Prudence, think ahead. Fortitude, courage, bravery, patience. Now the vices were considered likely to erode man's happiness. And these included obviously the 7 sins, but also many others. Some of these, okay, can reduce us to the point, okay, where they confuse us. So what are the essentials of being good, according to these philosophers, as well as, hey, the founders in their aspects? And these 4 ideas were very current in their thinking. So, daily reflection in recognizing that to be virtuous was a journey. That it wasn't something that was a fix-it pill. It was not going to happen overnight. It's a lifelong pursuit of self-improvement, that using reason to control our passions and emotions. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And not only improving ourselves, but serving others would be an important outcome of being good. So from Jeffrey Rosen's book, The Pursuit of Happiness, a book I highly recommend. It came out in February of 2024. He writes, the classical definition of the pursuit of happiness meant being a lifelong learner with a commitment to practicing the daily habits that lead to character improvement, self-mastery, flourishing, and growth. Or as Cicero himself wrote, the mere search for higher happiness, and not merely its actual attainment, is a prize beyond all human wealth, or honor, or physical pleasure. It's interesting. So what's the struggle between reason and passion? Because this is what the founders, okay, recognized and understood. That our daily struggles are to reconcile between reason and passion. Pythagoras divided our soul between rational and irrational, and the rational being reason, and the irrational being passion and desire. So our founders often wrote about their own struggles in tempering their passions by using reason. And what I think is so essential here is, despite the fact that our founders were flawed, they recognized that they were flawed. I think that's an essential piece that we need to understand. Emotions like anger, remorse, and jealousy are not productive. They will not accomplish anything, so you must keep them under control. So I'm moving away from the founders right now, because this is a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mother to her daughter, meaning Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And her mother said to her, no. Those are not productive. Anger, remorse, and jealousy are not productive. Move away. And she did. Reason must control passions, and if you're successful in doing that, that will be the achievement of happiness. So, perfection is impossible. So once we get that out of the way, that helps, right? But working toward self-improvement will bring happiness. So Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 22, says, without virtue, man can have no happiness in this world. He wrote that in an article that he wrote at the age of 22. James Harris is a British man, and he wrote, for all you sportsmen here in this room, our happiness is dependent not on the success, but on the aim. As any sportsman will tell you, the joy is in the pursuit. Now, I had some people question me on that and said, well, if I don't catch a deer in deer season, that's not good. And I've had others tell me, well, I'm still going to go out to hunt the next year. So maybe it is. If I don't win a World Series, does that mean I'm not going to be playing baseball next year? Or is the pursuit continue to keep me going? And then, of course, is Thomas Jefferson in his 70s, who says, if the wise be the happy man, so these sages say, he must be virtuous too, for without virtue, happiness cannot be. So he hasn't changed his mind, even at the ripe old age of 73. So, in forming a government where virtuous people is necessary. So, this is kind of interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question. And you can talk to your neighbor. And then you can ask the following question. If personal virtue is so important for happiness, should there be a government based upon a virtuous people? If so, what public virtues should the people have? Let's take 5 minutes to discuss which virtues you think would be the most important ones that the people should embody to make the government work best. Talk among yourselves 5 minutes? Okay, let's get back to the discussion, and let's get back rather to the, let's see how well you were in figuring out which of the virtues might be the emphasis of some of our founders. So the next section of what we're going to talk about is applying virtue to form a new government. So they were not sufficient in sufficing to discuss personal self-improvement or personal virtue. They now had this incredible opportunity to do something that none of us are going to have that opportunity to do, which is to form our own government. And they will end up having this opportunity. And as we said when we looked at the preamble, they recognized that a virtuous people was going to be important in order to maintain this government. So they're going to look back to the ancient philosophers once again and see what they said about what the role of government should be. So let's take a look and see some of the thoughts that the Greek philosophers, like Socrates, said about the purpose of government should be to create good and proper citizens. He also said that the purpose of a ruler is to ensure the welfare of the common people over their own interests. It was not to acquire pleasure or wealth. Pluto added, in his 8th book of the Republic, the purpose of government is to advance human excellence and human virtue. Aristotle, in his Politics, writes that political science is concerned with the happiness of the people. Thus, the ends serve as a means to the end, which is nothing less than the human good. Aristotle had created a chart, if so to speak, that has been used in describing different types of governments. And he talks about the rule of one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. Good governments are often in the form of monarchy. Let's recognize, okay, that this is not always exactly correct. There can be bad monarchs, but typically monarchs are essentially good in the eyes of Aristotle. But a bad government would be a tyrannical government, or a tyranny, a dictatorship. Those would be types of governments, okay, that would be considered a bad government, a government where we would consider that a rule by one. A rule by the few, typically a good, would be an aristocracy. Now, an aristocracy in his time was not necessarily that wealthy, which we look at today. An aristocracy in those days was typically those who were considered philosophers, and not necessarily, okay, the wealthy in the Greek times. The bad types of governments were the oligarchs, those who were, okay, only seeking their own wealth at the expense of others. And the rule by the many was the polity in the Greek times, but also the republic. Okay? And a bad government, in the eyes of Aristotle, was a democracy, demos meaning the people. But his view was that the demos, or the people, were generally uninformed and were basically, okay, unreliable and ignorant. The anarchy would be another form, if you will, of a rule by the many, which would be, therefore, a bad government. Cicero, who lived later, he appreciated Aristotle's, okay, chart and types of government, but he did disagree with democracy. He did feel that democracy did not necessarily have to be bad and had potential to be good. But he supported a mixed type of government. It may ring a bell with some of you, okay? But the idea where all three forms of government existed within the same government. He stated, the good life is impossible without a good state. That's a state with a small s, thus meaning a nation or a city-state. And there is no greater blessing than a well-ordered state. The bottom line for Cicero was a virtuous responsibility. Politics is not a passion, it's not about passion, it's about virtue. Those would be the summary, if you will, of what Cicero would be talking about. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers would have read from all of these philosophers, not just the ones that I've chosen, but they would take from that, so that Locke, Montesquieu, and Hume, just a few of the philosophers. Locke would say, moral laws apply to everyone, thus reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who would but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possession. He equates moral law with reason. And reason would say that you don't go and harm another in their life, their health, their possessions. Montesquieu says the name of virtue in a republic is the love of one's country. That is, the love of equality. It is not a moral or a Christian, but a political virtue. And it is the spring which sets a republican government in motion. To conclude, the honest man is the man who loves the laws of his country. And Hume, and I apologize because I didn't give you the name of his book that this quote comes from, was the Treatise on Human Nature, says the virtue of justice is a cornerstone of moral character, emphasizing fairness, equity, and respect for the rights of others. So you've seen quite a few different virtues within, okay, the thoughts of the ancients and also of the Enlightenment thinkers. So maybe they matched some of the thoughts that you had. So let's talk about our history briefly. So the evolution of colonial thought. My intention here is not to be historical, but rather, okay, to demonstrate the slow progress between, or toward, if you will, rebellion and independence. So during the 1750s, there was a hint that maybe there should be some consolidation. Benjamin Franklin had written up what is called the Albany Plan of Union, where he had suggested that for their own defense, that they should, the 13 colonies, join together. It was rejected out of hand. And the 13 colonies said, no, we're going to do this alone. So even though we were in the midst of, okay, the French and Indian War, they decided no, they were going to remain independent states. But in the 1760s, after the French and Indian War had ended, there was irritation. The British control all of a sudden, okay, started with the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Acts, and started to, okay, cause a little friction among the colonies or in the colonies. And this irritation, okay, started to bother them. And then in the 70s, annoyance. The Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, those blasted, intolerable acts. And then in 1775, we have this skirmish in Lexington and Concord. Ouch. And then the crucial year, 1776. 4 important documents. So as we approach the 250th anniversary, 1776, we should remember not just the one biggie, but there were several other documents of importance. So we'll look at each one briefly. The Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Didn't have a lot to do with virtue, so we'll skip over that one pretty quickly. Then we'll have, okay, Thoughts on Government, a real biggie in my mind. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, more important than people think. And of course, the real biggie, the Declaration of Rights. Of independence, rather. So Thomas Paine wrote The Common Sense in January of 1776 when it was published. And the reason I said it's not that important for us to look at is because it doesn't really talk about the importance of virtue, but it was a galvanizing document. Because what it basically said, as the title says, it basically says to a lot of people, you know what? England's 3,000 miles away. So what if they got this big army and navy? I mean, they're going to do a lot of traveling to get over here. And on, okay, with some of his, okay, statements. So people, okay, were kind of somewhat moved. Some of it illogical, but nonetheless, okay, it was a galvanizing document. But Thoughts on Government by John Adams was really a very, very interesting document. And it was really interesting for the following reason, and that is, it fits perfectly within our scope. But he was asked by a friend, what would you do if you could, form your own government? Now, John Adams, really hadn't thought about that and didn't really think that that was going to be that possible, but he wrote a letter nonetheless. And within that letter, okay, he puts down a few thoughts about what he thought, if he had the opportunity, what that government might look like. Now, nobody else is really thinking about those in those terms. But it's interesting to see the kinds of thought and the kinds of deep thought that he's given to this idea. So he's saying, well, we should have multiple branches. He's also thinking that it should be a republic, that should be division of power with checks. There should be a structure for appointments and elections. And there needs to be an independent judiciary. Interesting. None of those things existed in Britain. And yet, here he is, okay, writing down those ideas in this kind of letter. Kind of interesting. And then he adds a bunch of virtues that are going to be benefited as a result of this kind of government. People will be humble. They'll be more patient. They'll live in moderation. They'll be industrious. They'll be frugal. They'll be civil with each other. Let me read a passage, an actual passage from the document. He says, a constitution founded on these principles introduces knowledge among the people and inspires them with a conscious dignity, becoming free men. A general emulation takes place, which causes good humor, sociability, good manners, and good morals to be general. The elevation of sentiment inspired by such a government makes the common people brave and enterprising. That ambition which is inspired by it makes them sober, industrious, and frugal. You will find among them some elegance, perhaps, but more solidity. A little pleasure, but a great deal of business. Some politeness, but more civility. So he's thinking of virtue with the formation of this new government. Notice the bottom. The above are safeguards against avarice and those seeking power. Those are what his thoughts are. And then in June 12th, 1776, George Mason from Virginia writes the Declaration of Rights for Virginia. And within those rights, he writes in Article 15 that no free government or the blessing of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. And then in Article 16 he writes that religion can be detected only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Now, to understand why this point is really remarkable, is he is writing this for the state of Virginia, which has an established church, the Episcopal Church. Which means all of your rights are protected if you're an Episcopalian. This defies that. And then we have our Declaration of Independence. So tonight we're not going to go through the entire thing because we're going to do that in the next couple of weeks. But we will say this, the second paragraph, just as a warning, has been probably the most important document shared by the entire world, this second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now you might be saying, how is that possible? Well, it's because, remember I said to you before that everybody goes to church at that time? Well, in the churches, okay, everyone would hear all about everything that I'm talking to you about. So everybody is aware of these aspects, of these virtues, and everything about, okay, what government should be about. This is not new to people. That all men are created equal, subject to some controversy. What you don't know, and may not know, some of you may know this, the first draft that Thomas Jefferson wrote included freeing the slaves. However, as you may imagine, when it was brought forth to the Second Continental Congress, there were a few people that did not like that provision. It was immediately excised. So what we have here does not include anything at all referring to the freeing of slaves. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, as you know. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for today's discussion, we're going to emphasize the term, the pursuit of happiness. Because the pursuit of happiness was not exactly the terminology that one might have expected at this particular time. Throughout American history, the meaning of pursuit of happiness has evolved in unexpected ways. The ancient wisdom that defined happiness as self-mastery, emotional self-regulation, tranquility of mind, and the quest for self-improvement, as you know, came from many of our ancient philosophers. We know from Franklin, we know from the thoughts on government. You've seen what we've talked about tonight. This is not unusual. However, many of you in this room, like myself, may have gone to school where the pursuit of happiness was referred to as another word for property. And that's what I learned when I was in college. That pursuit of happiness meant your possessions, your property. And that was an interpretation that was very strong in the 1960s, in the 1970s. This is relatively new in going back to the philosophers, so that now I think this is the better interpretation, that pursuit of happiness, given what I've gone through with you tonight. I really do believe that Thomas Jefferson meant this notion of self-mastery, this notion, of self-regulation, this notion of self-discipline. So the founders recognized that their burgeoning government could only be maintained by virtuous citizens. How do we know this? Well, colonial governments were transformed into state constitutions. So as soon as, well, even before the Declaration of Independence. So it started earlier. Many states started to take their colonial charters and transform them into state constitutions. Many of them hardly changed any of the words. They just transformed them, okay, into state constitutions. The Second Continental Congress authorizes a committee to start writing a national constitution. Now I want you to pay attention to the date. It's only 8 days after they signed the Declaration of Independence.
And there was no internet.
What's that?
And there was no internet.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. But the key is, when you think about, okay, the fact that how intense our founders were. I mean, when you think about the French Revolution as an example, they weren't interested in forming a government as much as they were destroying it. Whereas our founders not only were thinking about independence, but how could they form a government, and what kind of a government, and how that government, okay, needed to be a government that was going to be a good government. And it didn't take long for them to start that process. And if the founders were to be successful, they must be able to govern themselves, which therefore meant that they needed to be governing virtuously, to govern the government that they were going to form. So here we are. Back to, okay, our preamble. And I'm hoping that you can now look at the preamble with a new set of eyes. Because we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. So, we the people are in charge, right? No problem. We got this. But then Federalist 51. Okay, James Madison wrote this particular Federalist paper. There were 85 Federalist papers. We're going to talk about this in another episode, okay? We talk about the Federalist papers and how important those documents are. But look at what that particular part, one of the most well-known parts, okay, of the Federalist 51. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. And in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. So can we depend on human nature? What do you think?
No.
No.
So what do you think these auxiliary precautions are?
Balance of power.
Good. So they are the institutions that they created. Those were the institutions that we're going to be talking about, okay, in the next couple of weeks. These kinds of institutions were to be the insulation of trying to make sure that if human nature gets in the way, that they would be able to keep the country from being abused or corrupted. Too many shaking of heads here. Now, the framers recognized the influence of human nature. So here's just a few quotes, all from the year 1787, the year that the Constitution was ratified. Alexander Hamilton said, "Give all the power to the many, they will oppress the few. Give all power to the few, they will oppress the many." Benjamin Franklin said, "There are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money." Anyone want to differ with that? And George Mason, "From the nature of man, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will always, when they can, increase it." So, where are we now? Over the years, we've transformed from being good to a feeling good philosophy. See, the 1980s have been referred to as the greed is good decade, the age of hedonism and materialism, or simply put, the age of self-gratification, temporary pleasure rather than lasting happiness. Over the years, we've transitioned from a being good to a feeling good philosophy. As I quote from Rosen's book, The Pursuit of Happiness, classical moral philosophy had fallen out of core curriculums. These texts, the works of the ancient philosophers, were an essential part of the curriculum of American high school, college, and law students in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, but were no longer considered central to what educated Americans should know. Basically, what he's saying is we stopped basically talking about virtue in the classroom. And as a result, if you say the word virtue today, people probably look at you and say, "What's that?" So what is the feeling good philosophy? In a nutshell, pursuing instant gratification or temporary pleasures. Living in the moment with little regard for future impact. Basically, living in the present, disregard of the future. Allowing our emotions to dictate our behavior. Often making decisions that place our immediate wants ahead of any responsibilities to ourselves or even our loved ones. Pretty drastic. But let's go back to our founders. I'm surprised none of you, raised this during my talk. Because there's a lot of hypocrisy, that our founders had. Because here I am trying to build up these founders as if, they were saints. They weren't. And you know that. So how do we reconcile, the necessity of striving for virtue with realizing that our human nature often demonstrates our failings to measure up to what we espouse as the importance of pursuing happiness? In other words, it seems to me we've gotten to the point where if someone tries to do something good, we automatically want to say there must be something sinister behind it.
Exactly.
That's how, the absence of virtue has essentially taken over. Because when something virtuous is done, we don't even recognize it or aren't willing to recognize it. The good news is our founders understood virtue as a goal, and they weren't afraid of it, and recognized they were flawed. And even if they were flawed, they aimed high. So their foibles were allowable not because it was a good thing, it was simply, the fact that they were trying and do better in some capacities. In other capacities, they didn't do well. For example, the easiest example I can use is our Southern founders. Now, they all recognized that slavery was wrong. I don't care how history wants to portray it today. They did not say that slavery was right. They knew it was wrong. In the last quote, Patrick Henry, as many of them, admitted that it was wrong, but they could not allow their economic survival to do away with it. Thomas Jefferson, he knew it was wrong. Like I said earlier, he put into the Declaration, to free the slaves. And, he knew what should have occurred, but that wasn't going to happen. But this is not the only shameful, accounts for our framers and our founders. John Adams was recognized for his vanity. He was a very prideful man. he had a really difficult time. But the irony is, he would always write about it. He was always, saying, how terrible, it was awful, and he would write about it. I'm so vain. I think she wrote that song because of John Adams. The bottom line is they recognized their flaws. No, Abigail would always talk to him. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that I love is when they were dating. Who would do this today? I don't know. While they were dating, Abigail and John on one of their dates decided that they were going to tell each other about their flaws. I'm not sure how far that would go today. And yet, that's what they did. And of course, Abigail got upset on one of them. She denied the fact that and John very, very smartly, recanted. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were womanizers. Their lust, was very well known. James Wilson, he talked all the time about frugality. He ended up, a spendthrift. He owed more money, as did Jefferson. Poor Jefferson's daughters, ended up with $20,000 in debt. They had to end up selling everything. They couldn't keep the Monticello. So all of them were flawed. But they knew it. They admitted to it. So the question, of course, is, despite recognizing their own personal foibles, they believe that personal self-governing, in other words, looking at ourselves and governing ourselves, is an important part of our lives in order to seek our own happiness. And now that you have the opportunity to get a structure of government, then we need to do the same thing as a people in order to protect our government and to do what we can to be virtuous, which is what? We need to do what's best for our government, despite our flaws. So in the next 2 weeks, we will examine the framers and recognize the important principles and rights that they wanted to see this new government protect, the type of government and people that would be needed to do so. So we will be doing that. But before we do that, we have a little bit of time, and I would like to see what your thoughts are. Today, is virtue a necessary ingredient to preserve our government? Another question is, should we strive to improve ourselves in the pursuit of happiness, recognizing that we may fail often along that lifelong path, or should we simply live our lives moment to moment with no ultimate goal other than the ephemeral pleasure of the moment? So the question, in my modest opinion, is, what do we do as a people? Because we are the people. This is our government. And in the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about, what that means through the principles that our framers and founders put together. How do we get virtue back? Is it necessary?
Yes.
And what means do we have, in doing so? I leave it to you. Do we have answers?
Some people say they do.
Yes.
So, you've gone to such great lengths to show how these things were, there was a common consensus, there was self-evidence of what these virtues were. It seems, if we're going to rebuild now, how do we even, there's nothing that's self-evident in such a, in our society now. It's, besides the sheer magnitude and number of people, mixture of cultures, and it's the beauty of it, but it's also how do we get some kind of agreement on what those core virtues are anymore, because nothing seems to be self-evident to people anymore.
To your point, John, if you look at the ancient philosophers and you look at the Eastern as well as the Western philosophers, if you go back in time, they all agreed on this. The problem is, we have reached perhaps a worldwide consensus that virtue may not be as important as it was once. So it's too many years perhaps, but do we have the need to be reminded that such a thing as virtue is important? In other words, I hear what you're saying, but it's not because we have too many cultures that, okay, are in the mix. All of these cultures at one time or another essentially agreed to these virtues. So we've lost the pathway, if you will. So how do we bring it back? That's, I guess, our $1 million question.
Right, and I don't mean to imply that it's the multiculturalism, because wherever your religion or where you're
Right.
from, there are these things that unite us and that are common, whatever your religion. There's so much intersectionality.
Right.
So, but yeah.
And can I just say too, I think there is, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there is a cloaked attempt to claim back virtue in our country under the guise of someone else determining what those virtues or values are, called think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. And how do we shatter that construct to go back to the source and the essence of what was really intended. It's rhetorical in a sense, because I'm certainly struggling with that every day.
Yep.
Is this a component of your program in civics education for the 8th graders in our state?
Well, this part of virtue, okay, we try to emphasize in the earliest of grades.
Excellent.
Character education needs to begin very early, but it needs support, and I don't want to be one to condemn, but it doesn't seem to be. When I put the signage, okay, up where the churches and the schools and the families and the governments, okay, are all intertwined in the 18th century promoting virtue, that doesn't exist today. I mean, I hate to say this, but it doesn't even exist in the churches to the extent, okay, that it once did. And that to me, okay, is frustrating, because I feel like that should be first in foremost, okay? I don't know about you, but these virtues here seem to be fundamental. Not extreme, but basically fundamental.
It doesn't seem like a stretch at all. No matter what, we may all disagree on what the problems of government are today, but no matter what we each think they are, it's not a stretch to connect them to a lack of these virtues.
Right.
It's not difficult at all. What I get fearful of is, do we have the strength as a people, which is going to come from a lot of self-education and espousing that, and a lot of work at the ballot box. Do we have the strength to accomplish it? That's a scary thought.
Well, I mean, I do think fortitude, okay, is an absent virtue. It takes a lot of strength, and it's a tough one.
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation with a very well-intentioned friend about a particular politician, it's irrelevant who. We disagreed on whether he should be reelected, and when I brought up my thoughts, he said, well, you're right, but he voted this in for my district, so. And it's like, oh my goodness, there's the problem, the self-serving part of it is just painful.
If you look at everything, I mean, whether it's church, home, school, community, everything, I think the virtue's missing in all those places. It's not just one
No.
place.
Oh, no.
And I think the same thing with, when you see it with community, even in the community, lack of service. People don't want to give back as much as they used to.
Right. Oh,
They have too much time, they're too busy,
Right.
and which limits us, our choices in who we have for our government. Even in the community, people are not willing to take those risks as they used to be.
Right.
The service to the community is not as big as it used to be, so it has to start at home,
Right.
even before it gets any bigger.
Right. Pam?
I think the most frightening thing that I've hung up on is what that woman pointed out, and it's clear to me that there are people that are claiming virtue, and they're pushing their agenda, and it's scary that they could say what they're doing is virtuous.
That's right.
And that's, I'm like stopped now, I'm really scared of that, because that's not what I interpret as virtue, but they're saying that that's what they are.
So-called Christian.
Yes.
I think that we live in a McDonald's drive-through society where you order your burger, you get it in 2 minutes. I ordered something from Amazon at 8 o'clock last night. It was delivered before I came here. So we're in for instant gratification. You add that to social media, which could be a good thing, but I think social media has divided our country where when you give an opinion, all of a sudden, the profanity directed at you for your opinion, it's kind of like you don't want to say anything because somebody's going to be calling you names that you don't want to be called. So when you look at our advances in delivery of food, delivery of Amazon packages, delivery of messages, I can text you an email, Roger, and you'll get it before you get home. Whereas before, you sat down and you wrote that letter, you thought about what you were writing, and you put it in a mailbox. So I think sometimes this instant stuff is, you don't stop to think about what you're saying is going to divide the nation further. And I think sometimes social media gets to the point where you're not getting the right information, and we don't know how to solve this problem. We're saying, okay, well, we can wait to midterm elections, and then maybe we can get a new regime, and then, well, what do you do in the meantime? Because I know for me, it's a big source of anxiety, huge source of anxiety. This isn't how I was brought up. And I think it's very hard for somebody who's being brought up to, of our generation, of you'd be nice to other people, you think of other people's feelings, and all of a sudden, perfect strangers are going to tell you to go yourself. You know, it's like, that's not the country I grew up in, and it's not the one I want my son to have children in.
It's also frightening
they're rewriting history, so we talk about virtue and the ancient philosophers. Banning books in schools. Then they wanted to change the Smithsonian because slavery wasn't so bad. So if they're writing history and they're changing curriculum in schools, how do we develop a new generation of virtuous students?
Well, part of what I'm trying to do here is to give an opportunity, first and foremost, to bring up the issue of virtue. Secondly, okay, to talk about, okay, what the government is supposed to be about, and allow for people in the ensuing weeks to do this. I'd like to know, okay, if this is viable, this is important enough for me to be doing, because I have other people in other places that think it is as well, and they want to do something similar to this. If you think this is something important, you know, to me it's a countering of not having enough information, not having enough understanding to be able to take back, if you will, what we've lost and be able to regain, okay, what we've lost. Because to your point, and I think it's as a people, it has been easy for us to be complacent because our country has done very well. And this complacency means I didn't need to know all of this stuff because things were going pretty well. And now we're realizing that that complacency, okay, is hitting us, and we're realizing that that complacency, okay, could come back and bite us. Am I correct?
Yes. And if we don't have this knowledge, how do we pass it on?
Well,
This is the answer. This very,
Exactly.
this is what I'm trying to do.
Exactly, it's,
To start, okay, and if we do this in more communities and we do this in more, okay, places, people have a better understanding, hopefully. And maybe that's what we can do. That's all I'm trying to do.
we can all leave here and do something.
Yes?
Roger, we know what Benjamin Franklin said, but we have to remember what Aretha said. And I think that's what's missing, is respect. Respect for each other, respect for the children, animals, elders. Just respect the people's opinions. I think respect is missing. And now we've lost our virtue.
Absolutely. The gentleman behind you?
I hear this question all the time because I've worked in this area a lot, and I apologize if I'm going totally off script here. But I have found in talking to people here in Africa, Europe, South America, that the most important thing that you can do is do what you can do. Do the thing that you can do with your neighbor. Do the thing that you can do with your family, with your children, with your spouse. Because frankly, institutions don't do much good unless the people that inhabit them are willing to uphold the things they're built upon. So if you are concerned about how do we fix this, look in the mirror and look to your left and right. Someone has to do the right thing because it's right, and someone has to start so that others can follow.
Thank you. John, you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just listening.
Yes, Paul.
Roger, one of the things you said a couple minutes ago, I think I would challenge, we don't have enough information. I think we have too much information, and we don't know which is right.
Well, we use more quality information.
Well, we're being every day we're being challenged, okay? But we don't know exactly how that information, okay, is, how information is being accurate, or how that information is is being given to us. And so a select group of people, okay, are willing to accept, okay, certain information, and another group of people are willing to accept another facet of that information. So my purpose is to not, okay, essentially deal with the present, but to deal with, okay, how, okay, our government was put together and allow for the people to make their own views and come up with their own decisions once they understand how the framers, okay, were putting their government together. To me, it's all based upon how did the framers of our government, how they put this government together, is how we should be looking at what is going on presently. And so to me, I don't think enough people have, okay, this understanding, because people can make the interpretations for you, but I want you to know, okay, at least what the government that was created, what their intentions were, and what they felt and what they wanted to accomplish. To me, that is, I think, the most essential, okay, thing that I can do for you. I'm not here to challenge anybody. I'm here to give information, to educate. And from there, okay, you make your own determinations, but knowing how the framers, okay, were thinking and what they were thinking. So to me, today was setting the tone that this notion of virtue was pretty essential, okay, to the framers. And it's not a message, okay, that is translated very often, because we don't think of virtue today. John?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between virtue and religion, and virtue in God, because it seems like they go to great lengths to keep those things separate, you know, as far as certain religions. And the Jefferson Bible, of course, he went through the Bible and basically took out all the miracles. And so like, what's just the stuff? And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because that might help us going forward as finding some virtues that we can agree on, regardless of religion or no religion.
Well, I think the most essential part about religion is Jefferson wrote a very important, okay, document that essentially talked about people's freedom to have their own views on religion. And of course, Madison inserted that into our Bill of Rights. As we're going to talk about in next week, is, okay, the First Amendment talks about two very essential pieces where we have no established church in our country, so that there is no one religion that the country espouses. So there's no established religion. The second piece is that you have the right to freely exercise your right. In other words, you can believe as you wish. Now, Jefferson was very, very impactful on that. He first started, okay, in, I think it was 1785, when he wrote his document, okay, in Virginia for the purpose of freedom of religion there. And then Madison, okay, took it further when he had an opportunity for writing the First Amendment. Now, many of them did not look upon established religions as essential, but they recognized spirituality as important. Okay, Benjamin Franklin was very, very, was pretty much a non-religious person, but very, very much, okay, spoke of God all the time. So he was not someone, okay, who was anti-God, if you will. He believed firmly in God. Some people would call him a deist. Well, a deist, okay, was someone who essentially believed that all one has to do is look at nature and realize there is a supreme being.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't like you had to believe in a particular religion. He just simply looked around and said, there's a God. And so it was not something that he would be in denial of. But he would have a lot of issues. And so one of the biggest issues for many of the founders was the difference between the Puritan view of predestination and other religions, okay, that said good works will get you to heaven. And predestination, of course, meant you were predetermined before you were even born as to whether you were going to heaven or hell. And many people said, well, that ain't going to work for me. So I think if I do some good stuff, you know, I think I have a good chance to get up there.
Yeah.
So you had these differences that certainly existed.
No, I know.
And one of the things that I think is extremely important for everyone to know about religion, that most all of our founders really believed in this. Most wars were started because of religion. And our framers wanted to make sure that that wouldn't happen in our country. As a result, they were trying to make sure that our country would not be divided on that issue.
But it already had. I was just saying, they punished the Quakers, they burned the witches, that was before they even wrote.
That was before, right. But not when they formed the government.
Okay.
Not when they formed the government. They recognized that, absolutely, in the colonial times. But they purposely realized in their study of world history that wars were often at the basis of religious, disagreements. And they didn't want that to happen in our country. So they were very wise. But as far as, they were also wise by not picking fights, if you will, over religion. If that makes sense.
You're the better historian than I am, but underneath those religious wars, there was also greed.
Of course.
Everyone says Northern Ireland was about religion. Oh, it was so much about economy, dominance, racial profiling. But I do agree, and it's somebody being more self-righteous or thinking they're more religious or they're better than, which is contrary to the virtues that you espoused and
Let's put it this way. Vices, are at the root of all of our disputes.
Yeah.
They're at the root, whichever one you want to choose.
Where do we sinners meet? Church. That's not to put it anyway. We're all fallen, our forefathers saw that they were fallen people.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop them, so.
Well, the bottom line is, I hope that tonight was a good night.
Absolutely.
Very much.
I hope to see you all next week.